Social Contagion. This is an amazing article from the Free Press, and this is what passes for journalism in 2023. It's valuable because we find out what events a mother went through bringing her child to a children's hospital for transgender therapy. Look at this sentence here. Because the mother calls Casey her son, and for the sake of clarity, we are using male references for Casey. Do you understand what that means? Journalism used to represent objective truth, things as they happened. But here, a journalist for the Free Press cannot tell the readers of this article whether this child was born male or female. I felt bullied. Mother of child treated at Transgender Center speaks out. She was told medical intervention would help relieve her 14-year-old's psychological distress. That's not what happened. When he was 14 years old, Caroline's son got a pharmaceutical implant in his arm that was supposed to help relieve his psychological distress. It was a puberty blocker called Serprelin, and it would continually release a drug for the next 2 years that would arrest further sexual development. Now think about the idea here that a parent would see their child going through the normal social anxiety of puberty, and they would get drugs and therapy, and possible get surgery for this child, just for going through the normal aches and pains of growing up. What is it about society in 2023 that's changed? Casey expressed no discomfort with his sex as a child, but when he turned 13, adolescence, he said, he discovered through friends and online that transgenderism was a thing. He started researching this and felt, holy crap, you can do that? Soon he was declaring he was gender fluid, Casey explains. This means that my gender changed based on the day. Then it got to the point where I was never feeling masculine or like a boy. After about 6 months of being gender fluid, Casey says, I decided that I was a fully transgender girl. Like I wanted to present as a girl and I wanted people to see me as a girl. So I started to socially transition. I was going by a different name and using she, her pronouns. So I guess from this paragraph, this was a boy as a child going through the pain of puberty. It's very hard to talk to girls. It's very hard to socially fit in. So after peer pressure from other children online, this boy decided he was a girl. That's peer pressure. That's as old as time.
Is that makeup I see on your face, young lady?
No, ma'am. I mean, yes, ma'am. Well, just a little.
How many times have I told you? You're too young to wear makeup.
Now, Mother, I don't...
Shut up, Leslie.
But, Grandma, all the other girls at school are wearing makeup.
But if all the other girls at school jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff?
Oh, right.
What?
No,
And
no,
you
no,
don't have the sense that you were born with. You have...
I hate to interrupt this little episode of the Waltons, but could I get a room?
There's nothing new about that, and yet we now have children who, instead of simply being wallflowers or introverts, who keep to themselves, who are loners, who don't quite fit in, now we have entire teams at children's hospitals ready to step in. Let's read on. Instead of simply talking to this boy about the birds and the bees, the mother was assured by the psychologist at the Washington University Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital. The St. Louis Children's Hospital. Oh, they even have nice little things for children on the outside of the hospital. But what are they doing on the inside? So she speaks to a psychologist who prescribed this drug, a severe drug, a puberty blocker, for a child's psychological mood changes. The child got worse. Now, what's never delved into here, was this child already on the trajectory to feeling suicidal? Did the treatment and hormonal therapies and transgender talk from adults, did that have any effect on this downward trajectory?
Right now, there are young people sitting in their bedroom, doors closed, silent, scrolling through social media, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'll ever be loved. You are loved. You are heard. You are understood. You do belong. And I want you to know that as your president, all of us on this stage have your back. Today, I'm about to sign an executive order that directs key federal agencies to protect our communities from those hateful attacks and advance equality for families. No one knows better than the people in this room. We have a lot more work to do. A lot more work to do. I don't have to tell you about the ultra-MAGA agenda attacking families and our freedoms. 300 discriminatory bills introduced in states across this country. In Texas, knocking on front doors to harass and investigate parents who are raising transgender children. In Florida, going after Mickey Mouse, for God's sake.
This may be a child that was going to be going through these changes anyway, or perhaps the well-meaning adults made it worse. So we've got a psychologist at this hospital prescribing puberty blockers, something that's implanted in this child's arm. The boy's father thought that counseling would help, and he wanted Casey to see someone in tune with LGBTQ issues, and eventually discovered the Transgender Center. Both parents had to be giving this child advice to seek the most severe physical changes to their body with a device implanted into this child's arm to change their gender. So you needed two parents to give this child bad advice, along with adult psychologists at this children's hospital. No wonder this little boy was confused. Casey arrived at the center with the agenda of stopping his puberty from progressing. How could anyone think that that would be a good idea? What the psychologist at the center did was solidify the idea that Casey needed medical intervention for his gender distress. Caroline was confused about why her son needed to halt his normal development at all. They received a whole bunch of medical disclaimers on how this could keep him from fathering children, should he change his mind later. They asked the little boy, who's still 13 years old, what he would do if he wanted to have children later. He says, "I'll adopt." Clearly this is not a decision that should be left in the hands of a child who is receiving all of this confusing advice from the adults around him. Caroline was becoming more disturbed by how the therapists seemed to gloss over the enormous implications of the decision in front of them. Casey's father was ready to approve the hormone blocker, but because they had joint custody and Caroline refused to consent, her veto stood. But 2 months later, she got a call from a nurse at the center who wanted to reopen the discussion. So she emailed her consent. This is how you destroy your child's life. You email consent for medical procedures for something that every child goes through, the pain of puberty. Suicide is an ever-present topic at the Transgender Center. Think about that sentence. It sounds like they're trying to encourage children to become mentally unstable. As long as these doctors and psychologists feel good about themselves, who cares how many children are driven to suicide after they visit this creepy children's hospital? Deaths were so rare that should provide some reassurance to transgender youth and their families. It is irresponsible to exaggerate the prevalence of suicide. This trope might exacerbate the vulnerability of transgender adolescents, so raising real-world concerns about how transgender transitions could cause someone to kill themselves or harm themselves in another way is something that's a trope, and therefore you have to proceed. After a few days as a patient, Casey asked to return home. He lives primarily with his father. He made it clear to his parents that his talk about suicide was just that, talk. The discussion within the clinic was how to keep the hormone blocker, in place. In the end, the doctors called for a consultation with the hospital ethicist. So here's the issue I have with the St. Louis Children's Hospital and the responsibility of these two parents. If killer clown John Wayne Gacy, a serial killer from the 70s and 80s, if he had stabbed their child with a knife, any parent would give their lives to protect their child from a serial killer stabbing their child with a knife. But they go into a hospital and the psychologists and ethics consultants and these other people at the hospital talk them into doing the same thing. And it takes two parents, I guess, to say, oh, as long as responsible authorities are stabbing my child and causing them great psychological and bodily harm, I'll go ahead and give my permission, because society is never wrong. Medical science is never wrong. Now you've got all these adults at this hospital whose only job is to torture children and make them even more psychologically unbalanced than when they came in. Why is all this being done? Because the Democratic Party wanted to create a new victim group who would vote exclusively for Democrat politicians, Democrat officials, and the Democrat agenda. There's nobody on the right pushing children to have hormonal blockers implanted into their arms. This is crazy. You look at this article, and you've got two probably well-educated parents who listened to society telling them this was okay. Well, it's not okay to torture your child. This is what happens when you have otherwise reasonable parents turn the rearing of their children over to leftist ideologues, progressive politicians, and psychologists and hospital ethicists who apparently have the welfare of children as their very last priority. Thank you.